I have to confess, I'm a computer scientist, so so my perspective is going to be different from the rest of you in some ways. But I've been fortunate in the past year or so to actually work with designers. So I'm beginning to kind of see their point of view. I'm looking at Sue there. No. So it's kind of an interesting experience when you come from a scientific background and then you're working with designers who have a different perspective on the problem as to how that feeds back into your work. So that's something that I might talk about later. There you are. So speckled computing, let me say something more about that. So it's a centre at the University of Edinburgh, and we do research at the Informatics Forum, that's on the left, and we also have an application centre where we take stable versions of the technology, the software, the algorithms, and then you have end users playing with the technology. The idea being that any new technology, you need some sense of evangelism, so going out and showing people what is possible. Quite often others take the responsibility for doing that, but in our case we felt that it makes sense to do it ourselves, and then by actually exposing ourselves to the real world, it's also feeding back into your research as to what are the real problems and what are the problems which are imagined by us. It keeps your feet firmly on the ground. So the vision, so this started in 2002, about a decade ago, and the vision was, how do you endow persons and objects with the capability to sense, the capability to process the data that you sense, and also network wirelessly. So you provide the connectivity, as it were. Connectivity not with the outside world exclusively, but also with other such devices that you have around you. So it's the network which is important. And what you're essentially doing is you're linking the kind of the physical world that we inhabit, the world of sensory data, with the world of digital information, the world of networks of computers, the world of the internet, the world of the World Wide Web. You know, how do you link these two? And where you have the physical world as a primary site of interaction. And the aim here is to bridge the physical and virtual worlds. So that was the vision 2000, and that slide hasn't changed. You know, that vision remains still. And what you had, not exactly around the corner, because we thought that it will be much sooner than we anticipated. What we thought would happen is that there was a new internet protocol. So internet is the underlying layer on which all these entire IP network is based on. So you had we were at that time, or we still are in many cases, the internet protocol version 4, and we were running out of namespace in there. And what that really means for us is that you're limited by the number of computers with unique addresses for your computer that you can connect onto the internet. And so we had to move to the next generation, it's called version 6. And with version 6, you can have 35 trillion separate subnetworks, and each of which could have 1 million devices in them. So it's almost as if you can uniquely address every grain of sand that you have. So we hope that we won't run out of space very quickly. So again, the idea then was, if that were possible, then the idea of connectedness, which we talked about 10 years ago, would really be a reality. And how do we what kind of research do you need to do in order to reach that stage? So this idea of connectedness between, not just between people and people, because that was happening with mobile phones and things of that sort. And that's the time when you had these brick phones, but we were kind of moving towards the smartphone then. It's between people and smart objects, and I say smart in inverted commas, because what I mean by smartness in this case is that they are in some sense context sensitive. They know something about the environment and location aware, because quite often location is a very important context in which to tag the data that you collect. So that was the vision at the time, and the idea here is that you have these sensors and you're getting these data from the sensors, and that's what they look like. That's a visualization of the data. It's a lot of sort of physical values that you are measuring in this case, and then you perform some computation on the data, and you abstract some value, and that's what you see down here. And that's what it kind of, for a particular application, that's how you visualize it. And then you have a number of these devices talking to each other, and then you abstract the value in a different way, so that you represent it like that. Then you might have entire sort of colonies or numbers of people interacting with each other, and you want to know the gross behavior, the overall behavior of an assembly of people, for instance. And that's where some people talk in terms of extracting intelligence from data, again in inverted commas. And it might look something like that, but I don't expect you to understand what these are, but it's just that you starting with some raw data and then making sense of the data at different levels. And this data could be personal, could be some physiological parameters such as your heart rate or your respiratory rate or flow or your activity, or it could be social, is how do you interact with people around in a room, for instance. You know, who are the people that are close to you, that over a period of time that you have been spending some time with? Who are the people that you have avoided? So it could be the social, or it could be societal, where, for instance, you are interested in the performance of a particular drug, for instance, over a cohort of people who are taking the drug, and you want to measure some particular physiological parameter, but you want to do this at a macro level over an entire population, say all the people who are suffering respiratory disease in Scotland, for instance. So that's kind of societal. So the data that you collect from the individual through different levels of computation finds its way into statistics over entire populations. So you are abstracting, you are kind of telescoping between different levels. Sometimes you're looking at data which is personal, unique to that person. At other times they are a data point in a population study. Okay, so there is a continuum in this right throughout. So these were our early forays into designing. So this is circa 2003 now. So these are devices where you can connect a number of sensors, and then you are able to process the data that you sense, and then there is a radio on that. You can network wirelessly with other such devices. So that's what you have in the top left. And these are our kind of experience of taking the same functionality that you have there and then miniaturizing this. And then these two are kind of more particular forms of these spec devices. And they are characterized by the kind of sensors that you have on them. For instance, this one has the ability to capture 3D human motion in real time. There's a full 3D motion in real time by attaching these sensors to different parts of the body, for instance. But doing it in an unobtrusive way, so you don't have cameras, so you're not located in a laboratory or things of that sort. You could be moving around in the real world. And I'll say something more about that, because the best way of describing for the audience here really is to show you applications of where that's used rather than beating your head with the technology itself. And for ones who are interested, it has three kinds of sensors on that. It's called a accelerometer, a gyroscope, and a magnetometer. And using these three sensor devices, you're able to measure the orientation in three-dimensional space of the object on which this is connected. This is a particular form. There's another spec called the rest spec, and that measures the respiratory rate and flow and activity. And I'll say something more about that because that's used in healthcare applications, principally. And you can also get the heart rate and the coughs and a few other things. So these are the physical instantiations of these ideas or specs. Let me say something. I'm kind of switching gears here. Say something about this idea of specs and how does that relate to people and how does that relate to design, especially. So this is the design of specs which is done in collaboration with designers in Edinburgh College of Art. And so you have the spec inside. And this was done for a show at the Edinburgh International Festival called Leaving Planet Earth, which is by a site-specific theatre company in Edinburgh called Orion. And the idea here was that that's a climbing arena, and these are people who are leaving planet Earth, and it's their experience as to what happens. And each member of the audience, and there are 150 each night, so this ran for 14 nights, is given this this glovelet, okay? And the actors are able to communicate with individual members of the audience, and that's written into the script as to what happens using these devices. And the way they communicate is they can communicate with groups of people, for instance, by the color of the light with flashes, or they communicate individually with a vibrator which buzzes and things of that sort. So, and that is written into the script, and different people feel different sensations as they're going through, and what happens to you is part of the storyline, etc. So that's a very visceral experience because you're not just sitting in the audience, but rather you are participating in the performance, where for the first time the actors can individually communicate in inverted commas rather than broadcasting something to the entire audience. You're communicating with either groups of members of the audience or individual members of the audience. Okay, so, and this is what they look like, and there are a number of design issues, for instance, like you need to have something which is easy to wear and can fit basically a large numbers of people, small, large, medium, things of that sort. So that's an example of where technology meets design with some very stringent requirements in terms of reliability. You need the 150 to work for 14 days. You don't care what happens before and after. And if it doesn't work for a member of the audience, they're going to be extremely annoyed and they want their money back. So you need to make sure that reliability is the principal criteria there. And of course, there are other performance criteria. Then I want to say something of the Design Specs workshop with Sue Fairburn and others in the audience actually participated. And the idea here was being able to work with design students and their tutors from 4 Scottish design schools, from Glasgow School of Art, Edinburgh College of Art, Duncan of Jordanstone, and Gray's, which resulted in some fantastic designs. So this is some of the process, and these are some of the culminating in an exhibition in Edinburgh with these 4 schools. So again, I'm not going into the details here, but an experience of this one, for instance, was a design from Gray's, and all of them were working prototypes with the specs inside, all done over a period of 4 workshops, culminating in this exhibition. So another very fruitful exercise in actually bringing designers and technology together, where we understand the constraints, where the designers understand the constraints of the technology, and we as technologists get a view into the design process, and that itself is very illuminating. It's not just people. I know you could be working with animals, for instance, and there are a number of design issues with animals. So this is a project that we have where we have our spec devices on, and you can see them here. These are being trialed in the teaching herd at the veterinary school. But these devices are actually on wild horses in southwest Spain as we speak. It's out there, and these are wild horses, and the biologists want to understand the behavior of these horses. You know, how much time do they spend lying down? How much time do they spend grazing? How much time do they spend moving around? Which horses spend time with each other? So what's the social behavior of horses? Because that'll give you some idea of the way disease spreads, and how do you and where they spend time, because that will give you some idea as to the ecology, the vegetation, etc., and how that needs to be taken care of. So what you get is things like the location of horses, how much time do their heads bend down, things like that. So this is an example of, again, sensors on the horses, collecting all this information, which is analyzed on the horses themselves and then uploaded wirelessly to a base station. And you do these in 50 horses, and then you get some population studies. In our case, it was a very functional design. You see there, I mean, some of the constraints was it had to run for a year. So we couldn't have a very heavy battery on that because it's going to horses. So we had a weight limit, we had a size limit. So the number of being able to run all these things for a year and getting the GPS location, getting the sensor data, had huge amounts of technical challenges that we had to. But I'm sure, if you had given this in the hands of a designer, they would have come up with a far more horse-centric design, as opposed to human-centric, which of course, the horse can't come back and tell you as to whether you're not going to get the same kind of feedback as you would with a human, but that's a challenge. How would you design for people who are not able to respond back to you? And I'm sure, even in the case of humans, there are disabled people who are not able to respond back to you as to how they feel, not easily. So those are design challenges again for. So I mentioned the Orion spec, which does 3D motion capture. So I'm going to say a bit more about this. And there's an example of a technology which at the moment is explicit, because you wear this on your, you strap this onto your various limbs, for instance. But in the future, it could be that it could be implicit. It could be in the fabric that you design, with the technology implicit in there rather than explicit. So these are the traditional ways in which you capture 3D motion. Those are mechanical systems that you have there. And you have these, what's called inertial magnetic systems. There are lots of wires connecting you. And same is true there. And what you really want to do, this was the wish list. Can we capture, analyze, and understand motion, and do this in a fully wireless way, so that you don't have all these wires, you don't have suits that you need to wear, which is easy to use. And then you can by doing that, you banalize the technology so that you democratize its usage. When you think in terms of, by the way, this is before you had things like the Microsoft, what's it called? I can't remember the name. Sorry? Connect, yes. Microsoft Connect. So before the days of Connect that we started this work. And another thing which I would add is that you should be able to do this any place, anywhere, rather than have to dance in front of a camera or something of that sort. Okay, so that was another wish list for us. And this was the second generation, if you can call it that. You can see that it's quite thick and proud, only it stands on top of the skin. It's got this little antenna, a whip antenna, that needed to communicate. And then you had a strap which connected this to the limb. And this is the most recent design where you see that it's much flatter, it kind of sits well in the skin. And then for the straps, you actually have these wings here that you can put a strap around. And this was our very first motion capture demonstration, and what's happening here. This is about circa 2006. You have the data which is being connected to a commercial software for animation, a 3D animation software. And at that time, at least, the way you would animate something is that you would have a storyboard, and you would go to a mocap studio. It'll take about, I don't know, 2 days of their time doing that, and then you get the data coming back, and then you'd correct it, and then go back. So you iterate through this process, and it's a very expensive process. It costs about $700 an hour to actually hire time in a mocap studio. It's an expensive process. And also the designer loses control. So how do you give control back in the hands of the designer so that he or she can sit in front of the desk, the computer, and be able to capture human motion? So we work with a few studios, animation studios, and what normally takes 3 days actually took literally 2 hours to do. And here's an example of a person doing this. So I'll just sort of cut this through. So it's a character called Imp. It's a children's character, and he needs to exaggerate its walk because of the disparity in the length of the limbs. And this, after 2 hours, was the end result that you see. Is the two of them coming together, and then you have a sequence. So the experience itself is one where the designer, in this case the animator, she kept full control of what was happening rather than passing control to someone else doing it for her and then passing it back and then going through the process. And that's part of the creative process now, which originally they had. When you think in terms of animators, they always have control of the creative process. They understand the medium. The medium might be different. You know, it could be stock frame, or it could be all the various plasticine and things of that sort. They understand how to use it, but they keep control over it. And this is returning control back to them. And we did other things. Unfortunately, you're not going to hear the music on this because my sound system is broken at the moment. I tried it just before, and I was trying to repair it, but not any success. But what you're seeing here is a live performance of a flamenco dancer with these devices, and maybe you can see this. And what it does, it creates the music of the band which normally accompanies a flamenco dancer, and you're mapping different parts of the body to different musical instruments, or the clapping, or the castanets, and the drums. So that's what you're doing here, and you have to do it instantaneously almost. So there should be no lag. So this is a real technical challenge for us. So that's an example here. So what you're doing is capturing human motion. And when people were talking about all the this idea of the scanner that you have here, my immediate question to you is, yes, you are getting the scan of a person in a static mode, yes, but people, when they wear clothes, you know, do walk around, move around, they sit down, they lie down. And I've had a lot of experience, maybe I'm not the right size, of when I buy something off the shelf, is it kind of, when you're moving and doing these things, they're not as comfortable as when you stood in front of the mirror and seemed all fine at the time. So one challenge could be, how do you capture, you know, if you capture this from a body scanner, can you sort of simulate the movement of the person, how they normally move, and how would that apparel that you have designed, how would that look on that person? So I thought I'd just throw that in. So we worked in lots of different ways. Like, it doesn't have to be one person, it could be two people, and how do you kind of analyze the interaction between tango dancers, for instance, or how do you analyze human gait for gait analysis? These are clinical gait analysis in this case. So how do you compare this with the gold standard, which is using 6 cameras with a reflective marker, you know, what you have in a mocap studio? The advantage of this is that you're able to get comprehensive data rather than slice of 20 minutes when the patient comes to the, so this is someone who's been fitted with a new prosthesis. You know, you want to see how do they perform in the morning as opposed when they're fresh, as opposed to the evening when they're tired. How do they perform at different times of the day? How do they perform on different surfaces, etc. So mobility, being able to do this in the wild, getting out of the studio is what is important. Yeah. So when Julian sort of mentioned this, he said, give a background on speckled computing and then move on to healthcare applications that you're aware of. So this is an example of what we've been doing in the area of healthcare. We're using these devices to measure, in this case, the breathing rate and flow, okay, and activity of a person. So this is the traditional way in which respiration is measured. So you have a nasal cannula which goes up your nose, and unless you're in a hospital, you know, trying to wear this for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is not a working proposition. So is there a way in which we can do this? And the reason you want to be able to do this is because there are certain classes of patients, and they suffer from a disease which is an umbrella term called COPD, or compulsive obstructive pulmonary disease. What used to be called, it's a kind of umbrella term for people who suffer from emphysema, chronic bronchitis, upper airways obstructions. You know. And the problem there is the following, that the condition is kind of managed by giving them certain medication. They have to take the inhalers, they have to do this regularly. If they don't do it for whatever reason, then their physiological condition goes up, such as respiratory goes up. They tend to become listless and the activity goes down. And if they carry like this for a length of time, they'll have to be hospitalized, which means that they'll have to spend about 5 to 7 days in the hospital, which is expensive for the NHS or any healthcare provider. But the intervention, if you find out that they are going the wrong way, is very simple. You have to make sure that they are taking their medicine. They don't realize it themselves sometimes. Okay. So if you're able to monitor these patients in this critical list, and then you can see the conditions going the wrong way, then you can intervene either by phoning them up or getting in touch with them to see is there something wrong, or visiting them or bringing them into the hospital, so that you can nip this in the bud, as it were. So that's the premise, that's the hypothesis here. And we designed this, and the design process itself was interesting because we had a contact group, a focus group of patients, of nurses, of carers, of doctors, both GPs as well as hospital-based doctors, and say, what is it that you would expect from something like this? So they came up with this list of things. There should be no buttons on it in order to turn it on and off, because we don't trust the patients to actually do it for us. It should run for at least a year, because we don't trust our patients to actually go and recharge it every night or anything of that sort. And there should be no downloading of the data. We don't trust the patients to actually put this in a dongle somewhere and download the data. It has to be done automatically. So a few others, such as it should be easy to clean, right? Because you sometimes in the hospital environment and you need to disinfect it and things like that, and it had to be waterproof. And we came up with the design, which kind of made our life on the technology side very, very challenging, but we managed, we succeeded in doing that. And I'm going to so what you do in all of this is that you run clinical trials first in hospitals, and then you sort of take it out to the community. And this was done in Elgin, not very far from here. And the idea here was that that's Mary Hill Health Centre, and the nurses, and the process is the following. So you get the patients who have already been admitted to the hospital with what's called an exacerbation, that the condition has worsened. Okay. And the patient leaves the hospital with this monitor. And then that data comes in, and the data is analyzed, and then it's presented to the doctors. And it's also how is information presented. So it's not sort of graphs and things like that. They wanted it presented. Finally, we arrived at this form as to how they wanted it presented. And what this gives you is, for a 24-hour period, it gives you the average, hourly average of the breathing rate in breaths per minute. How did that change over the 24 hours? And how did the activity of the patient change over the 24 hours? And the size of these circles here indicate the variations during the hour. So this might not be design in the sense that you think of design, but it is how do you design so that you can present the data in a form which is understandable by people who are normally not used to see this form of data again. So, and then that's a heat map there where the colors mean something else. So it took us at least 5 meetings, once a month almost, going through various iterations, and it took us roughly about 6 months to actually arrive at this. You might have thought, that's an easy thing, when you come up with. But it's not. So what I'm trying to say is this, that it's not just, it's not an issue of designing with material. Increasingly, you're designing with data, and how do you present the data in a form which is understandable to people every day. Okay, and we have different views on this. I mean, these devices actually talk to your iPhone or any other thing that you have. And this is a view that you get from the patient. So this is what the patient sees. They have a diary. They can, if they are feeling unwell or they want to say something about that, then they write that, and it automatically captures what the respiratory rate is, what is the activity rate, and what is the device they were wearing, and also gives you the location where that was taken. And so that is something that and it gets automatically logged and sent to your doctor. So the doctor can actually see if there's something happens, then it's something that the patient wishes to communicate with you. They can do this, and on the period, so we can actually adjust this for the 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after. They have the actual the physiological data. So the doctor can look at it. Okay, the patient feeling unwell. Why is he feeling unwell? Let's have a look. And this is done immediately. So you're kind of increasing the engagement between the patient and the doctor. Of course, what you might say is, I'm sure doctors will be inundated with lots of these messages coming through, but the doctor can choose to look at them, okay? And you might say this is a better way. It's still it's debatable whether this is a better way in which the doctor treats the patient, because you might find that the workload for the doctor increases, okay? But this is a balance that you need to strike, is that once you increase this interaction, once you increase the communication, what is the level at which you expect a service from the doctor? What is it that the doctor can ignore? What is it the doctor has to take account of? Because previously the doctor only looked at you when you came to the surgery or you phoned NHS 24 or something like that. So whereas now you have a 24/7 interaction between the doctor and the patient, does that increase the responsibility of the doctor? So these are other issues which needs to be, and this is the view that you have a doctor, and this is the hospital view where you have lots of data and graphs and things like that, because they're not interested in the individual ones, but they're interested in the population-wide. So for all the COPD patients, what's happening? And there are other data that you can sort of mash with this. You know, it's not the physiological data. It could be the weather data. It could be the air quality data, for instance. So this is an example of some work that we did where we collected what's called PM10, black carbon, which comes from the exhaust, and nanoparticles, and see how, and this is an ongoing project, how this impacts on patients who have asthma, for instance. Okay, so so the questions I have at the end of this, so this is my last slide, is really, you know, for second skin is, we talked about technology here, you know, that's my kind of expertise. But the technology here is very explicit. It's something that someone wears on the skin. When you think in terms of a second skin, the presumption is that this is something which is body hugging in some way. It doesn't necessarily have to be. But it's an artificial skin which goes on top of you. So could this technology be implicit in there? You know, is that, but if it's implicit rather than explicit, you know, there are lots of design issues where the boundary between technology and design really does kind of clash head on, you know. Is there a process, the dialogue, and how do you conduct this discourse between the two disciplines? You know, it's not very clear to me how that's done, because one of the things which I learned in the process of the 12 months working with the design specs is that the language of discourse is very different. You know, we tend to have a very kind of mathematical, precise, verbal, whereas designers tend to be far more kind of graphic. They kind of explain very things the way they experience it, things of that sort, which is foreign to scientists. And the scientists could do a lot with that, dare I say, you know. The services, you know, there are these services. It's, at the end of the day, it's a service that you're providing. It doesn't matter what the second skin is. It's a service that you're providing, and you know, what do you have in the foreground, what happens in the background, kind of ticking away. I mean, at the end of the day, it's assuming it's not horses that we're dealing with, it's the humans that we're dealing with. And there are some static behaviors, there's some dynamic behaviors. They're very different. That's our experience. You know. So if you're designing for someone by standing in front of a capture of some sort, that is a slice, but that is only a slice in the human experience. So how do we kind of try and make this more real by taking into account the dynamic nature of humans? But at the end of the day, all this should be a visceral experience. It should be an experience that you'd want to do rather than a chore. So that's where the designers really come to the fore. You know, how do you make this experience in such a way that it's natural for people to use, and the information or whatever it is which comes back is fed back in a way which is easily understandable, digestible, whatever. Thank you.